Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry we're getting started a little bit late, and thank you for joining us, though. I just want to let you know that we were having a few technical issues, so I'm going to repeat the instructions one more time before we get started. If you haven't already, you can set up your audio using the audio wizard, or you can also, please, we would like you to right-click on your name, click Edit Profile, and that way you can enter your name, your title, and your company, because we would like to know who you are, especially if you're going to be asking questions during the Q&A session. But anyway, welcome, and thank you for joining the Fielding School of Public Health's first Continuing the Conversation webinar of the year. A functioning political system is crucial to success in public health, yet the evidence in the United States suggests that there is a clear association between population density and partisan preference in elections, which leads to more gridlocked governance. In this webinar, Dr. Thomas Belin will discuss his research on redistricting and its impact on public health. Together with fellow researchers at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health, he has developed a tool that provides a one-number summary for proposed redistricting plans, which could serve as a helpful check on political polarization and lead to more effective governance and public health. Remember, if you have a question during or after this lecture, simply type it in the field at the bottom of the chat window in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, or if you've moved the chat window around, it's wherever the chat window is. All right, let's get started. Dr. Belin, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Owen, and I'm delighted to be doing this. I thought that before the November election might be a good time to talk about this work. The title is slightly different from what went out on the email, which adds the detailed density variation compactness, or DVC, scores on redistricting plans to promote effective governance and improve public health. And in some of the discussions I've had leading up to this, I'm going to emphasize that it's a particular kind of measure that I think is really helpful to think about what the impact of our redistricting plans are on the governance that, in a sense, we give ourselves. This is from the perspective that what we're engaged in is self-government, and there are senses that the political system would need to evolve in this country, and the idea is to make use of census data and geographic information, which is what redistricting plans are based on, in an effective way to use to help improve governance and improve public health. And there's a threshold question of what's the connection between public health and redistricting, and the threshold, one threshold that I had to move beyond was that there's a call for proposals for an Innovation and Research Award that Linda Rosenstock, when she was Dean of the School of Public Health, of the Fielding School of Public Health, put out a call for. And I put this idea out there that grew out of an insight that came to me when I saw a public television discussion of the 2004 presidential election, and Jim Lehrer asked the panel, why does the electoral map look the way it does with red states and blue states? And the answer that one of the panelists, David Brooks, columnist for the New York Times, gave was, well, if you had to boil it down to one quantity, it would be housing density. And I thought, well, that's an interesting point, because the more urban states tend to be blue and the more rural states red. And that it's also true within states that urban areas tend to be blue, favoring Democrats, and rural areas tend to be red, favoring Republicans. And I thought, you know, if you use that knowledge of the connection between population density and partisan preference, if you use it in a public interest-oriented way, you could actually address a lot of issues having to do with political gridlock, and the thought is that public health initiatives are often blocked by political gridlock. So I got $10,000 from this Innovation Research Award, which helped hire a student, and I'll talk about how we use that funding. In terms of, there's a technical side to the talk, and I'm just going to flash this briefly. I'm going to come back to this on the question of how to measure the performance of a redistricting plan, and there's a formula at the bottom, and I'm going to flash it up there just long enough to give you a feel for that there's something technical in the background going on. But I'm going to quickly transition into a discussion of the context that we're working in of redistricting. So from the Constitution, the call was, which was 1789, the call was to do a census within the first 3 years and every 10 years thereafter. So it was developed, Thomas Jefferson was the director of the first census in his role as Secretary of State in 1790. And every year ending in 0, there's a decennial census. And then at the end of the year, there's a reshuffling of the number of members of Congress for each state, and then data sets, information is transmitted to the states to go through a process of drawing districts within which the representatives from that state will be elected. And the term gerrymandering, which is represented by this cartoon, which dated from the early 1800s, is a reference to the fact that Elbridge Gerry, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, later became governor of Massachusetts and proposed a redistricting plan that had a long, irregularly shaped district that one critic said looked like a salamander, and another critic said, I think it looks more like a gerrymander. And that term has caught on to mean a notion of gamesmanship and some nefarious or illicit trying to cheat the political system in some ways by drawing districts in a way that has a political advantage built in for one partisan interest or another. So move forward. These are some examples of districts that have emerged in redistricting plans over time to give you a sense of the irregular shape that sometimes emerges from districts. These are not always completely unjustified in some sense. Sometimes these kinds of districts with irregular shapes are drawn in order to link together populations that might, if they lived along a freeway or if there were large concentrations of minority populations in certain areas where they might have shared interests. And one of the constraints in the redistricting process is that districts are supposed to remain contiguous, that is, that they're connected you could get to every point in a district from every other point of the district without lifting your pen, so to speak. But the way this is interfaced with the political system was illustrated dramatically in the state of Texas during the decade between 2000 and 2010. And there were a number of redistricting fights where there was a tie in one of the houses of the Texas state legislature after the 2000 census, which prevented a redistricting plan from passing. And so, but Texas added congressional seats, and so they needed to have a new plan. And so in 2002, a panel of 3 federal judges came up with a plan. And then in 2004, there was a high-profile controversy where Democratic state legislators left the state to avoid having a quorum in the state legislature. But finally, Republicans, which at that point controlled the legislature, were able to pass a plan. And these are 3 maps, the one that showed the previously prevailing districts, one that showed the federal judge panel, and one that showed what emerged after the Republican majority in the state legislature passed a new plan. And I submit to you that you can't, just by looking at the map, know which one of these is which. I mean, it happens to be the case that they all have somewhat irregularly shaped districts that are in some ways required to satisfy the Supreme Court rule that you should have what was I going to say? Well, every I'm blanking on the term that the one person, one vote standard of the Supreme Court. That was what I was grappling for. But I'm going to click ahead. It turns out I asked, can you identify which plan is which? And the fact is that I just did present them in chronological order. that these were different plans, but you can see how between the second and third plans, 6 congressional seats shifted. And you might ask, how could it be so sensitive to the shapes of the districts? And I give this example, a simplifying example, for illustration purposes. So if you have a hypothetical state with 7 districts, and across the state there's a 50-50 split in voter registration. And I have put down here 2 possible redistricting plans where across 7 districts, one plan has one party having like in the first district, party 2 has a 56-44 advantage in voter registration. In district 2, they have a 54-46 advantage. District 4, it's 50-50, and in districts 5, 6, and 7, in that plan A, the pattern reverses. And so in that redistricting plan, you might expect that even all of those elections might be close, especially in the where it's 52-48, and even where it's 54-46, maybe you'd have a charismatic candidate who would be able to overcome a disadvantage in the registration one way or the other. But you might expect the representation in that state to be relatively balanced in Plan A. Plan B, same state, but you could actually achieve a 50-50 split across the state by giving one party a 58-42 advantage in 5 districts and give the other party a 70-30 advantage in the other 2 districts. That, if you take the weighted average, it still works out to a 50-50 split across the state. And in political science, they call there's a term packing, like you pack the other parties, your opponent's voters, into a small number of districts. And in Plan B, Party 2 might regularly end up with 5 safe seats and end up with 5 out of 7 representatives in that state. In the article that I alluded to in this journal, Statistics, Politics, and Policy, I alluded to it in the first slide going through, we analogize this in a sort of a reductio ad absurdum to a possibly different system for determining a champion of the National Basketball Association, which currently is a best of 7 series where the home court advantage alternates, and each basketball game is played 5-on-5, which is of course the way we know basketball games to be played. But hypothetically, if you had not quite as strong a constraint on the rules of the game, you could say, suppose you played 7 games with just an average of 5 players on each team, and you had a system that was like in baseball where the team that wins the All-Star game gets to host the World Series more times. You award what we call numerical control to the team representing the conference that won the All-Star game. Well, that team that represents that conference could decide in this hypothetical system to have 5 games played with a 6-on-4 advantage, 1 game with a 3-on-7 advantage, and 1 game with a 3-on-7 disadvantage, and 1 game played 2-on-8. Where you figure, oh, you're going to lose 2 games, but you'd win 5 of the games, and the champion, if the system was that the champion is the team that wins more games, you could say, oh, well, that's fair in the sense that a priori before starting the season, the chance that each conference champion wins the overall championship would be 50-50, but it's absurd in its anti-competitive framework, because the outcome of the championship series is, for all intents and purposes, determined by the outcome of the All-Star game. And yet I say it's scary in its resemblance to partisan-controlled redistricting, because if you have one party or partisan advocates that are in control of a redistricting process, then they could build in these kinds of advantages. And a comment about it is that it doesn't really depend on the shapes of the districts. It depends more on their composition. And as we saw with the Texas maps, you can't just look at the map and see which way the advantage is going to go, but you know from looking at the map that it really can make a difference how the district lines are drawn. I have a little sidebar. I'm picking on Iowa here. I happen to be from Iowa, but I make a point to illustrate the importance of considering expert input. The Iowa's law governing redistricting has a statement in it that says the compactness of a district is greatest when the length of the district and the width of the district are equal. And related to our work, we make use of the notion of compactness, but I'll talk about, when I go back to the formula, I'll talk about why we use it at all. But there are different ways of considering what we mean by geometric compactness. There are 3 different versions of it here. We happen to use the first one, which is in our formula, which is the area of a district divided by the area of a circle encompassing a district, realizing that because states are sometimes irregularly shaped, you actually need to broaden your notion of compactness. And so, like for incorporating the Channel Islands or some of the coastline in California, that you're not going to have perfectly square districts anyway. And so it turns out, though, that the statement in the law of the state of Iowa is just plain wrong. The most compact shape is a circle, and these 3 different variations on geometric compactness give a little bit numerical values for what the compactness of a square is relative to a circle. Another theme that I'm going to put out on the table before tying it back to the redistricting is a general point that is important in the field of statistics, which has to do with how you're going to measure performance. There's a notion in statistics called a loss function, which just characterizes departures between a statistic and an ideal parameter value. And I illustrate the basic issue and the basic concern by considering a very familiar, simple statistical issue, which is how do you summarize the center of a distribution? We know the mean or the average is a commonly used measure of central tendency, but we also know that when a population distribution is skewed, sometimes we'll use a median as a better reflection of what we care about a distribution. And sometimes the mode, the most likely value, is of greatest interest. And it turns out the choice of a statistic to summarize the center of a distribution is going to depend upon your values in some sense. It's going to depend upon your loss function. And what I point out here as a point in mathematical statistics is that if you measure departures from the true value by the square of the difference between the statistic and the true value, then the best choice is the mean. But if you measure performance by the absolute value of the difference between the statistic and the true value, the median is the best. And if you have a so-called 0-1 loss function, the best choice is the mode. So the general point there is that when we go to a more complicated context like redistricting congressional seats, it's a very, very complicated question that we can't really encode mathematically. We can just say that in some sense a loss function encodes political values, and political here I mean not necessarily partisan, but political in a broader sense, that encodes what we care about in our political system. And there was an attempt some years ago, it didn't get very far, to automate the redistricting process, but it had some very interesting discussion about criteria for that could be used in the redistricting context, and it includes geometric considerations like compactness and contiguity, whether the district is contiguous, what they call polycentric criteria, which would be avoiding crossing jurisdictional boundaries, which might be cities or counties, ethocentric criteria, which refer to shared interests, or in what in the California statutes are called communities of interest. So you might have an irregularly shaped district because people live along a roadway or a coastline, and those people might share certain political interests because of the way their communities are laid out. And there also are ethnocentric criteria in the sense that are like the Voting Rights Act criteria would be ethnocentric, having to do with the racial ethnic composition. Crossing with all of this are some insights from the field of political science. In California, this has to do with kind of how competitive the political system is, and some research suggested that when the voter registration advantage differs from either, it's a little asymmetric, 3% advantage for Republicans to a 10% advantage for Democrats, those were the most likely scenarios for having a turnover from one party to the other, when looked at over time. It turned out that the 2002 redistricting in California had no districts within that range of voter registration differences. And when you looked at 865 elections over the ensuing decade that were governed by that redistricting, there was exactly one seat that changed from one major party to the other, which was less turnover than you had in the Soviet Politburo during the heyday of the Soviet Union. In response to the sense that the seats were too safe, and there were efforts during that decade and that succeeded to pass in California 2 initiatives that created a California Citizens Redistricting Commission. One initiative called the Voters First Act, and then that governed the state legislature, and then a Voters First Act for Congress, Prop 20, that governed the congressional elections. Both made a declaration that I'm going to list verbatim because they said, in the current process, politicians are choosing their voters instead of voters having a real choice. This reform will put the voters back in charge, and it created a 14-member commission to develop redistricting maps. And I would say that the statistic, the DVC, density variation compactness statistic that we developed, is an attempt to reflect this declaration of the that's encoded in the words of the Voters First Act initiatives, to give people a real choice by taking into consideration the composition of the districts. These are some specific criteria that were imposed on the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, that the districts shall comply with the U.S. Constitution and shall have population equality as nearly as practicable. That's the Supreme Court standard. And another language says that they shall have reasonably equal population. You might have very slight differences because of the discreteness of the counts of different census blocks. That a constraint will be that whatever gets put forward has to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. Districts shall be geographically contiguous. The integrity of cities and counties shall be respected. Communities of interest must be distinct from political parties, so this gets to those so-called ethocentric criteria. Districts shall be drawn to encourage compactness. Ideally, 2 state assembly districts, of which there are 80 in California, should combine into 1 state senate district, which would be 40 of them. And districts shall not be drawn to favor a political party in place of residence of candidates shall not be considered. That got a lot of attention because there were certain congressional members of Congress who ended up having to face off with one another because they ended up in the same district based on where they lived. But my comment is that even with all of these constraints, this still doesn't really constrain someone from the kind of the 58-42 advantage that in the hypothetical state with 7 districts. To me, this doesn't constrain the process enough to avoid the kind of partisanship and non-competitiveness that could be imposed in a system like that. So summarizing the applied context, it's hard to identify a measure of performance or loss function for a redistricting plan because of the complexity of the problem, competing interests, and we're in a political context. It happens to be the case that procedures differ across states. Some states are controlled by the state legislature, some by a state redistricting commission. There's software. We use the package called Maptitude, and there are other similar software packages that allow users to merge census data with other data, so you can, including demographic data, but also voter registration and voting information. And from that process, political consultants who have a partisan interest could easily abuse the process. And I think that it's fair to think of the problem from a game theory perspective, where partisan advocates can be expected, as you might expect them to seek maximum partisan advantage, but that there's a public interest that rises above that that we need to be aware of. Continuing with this summary of the applied context, that it might be inappropriate to consider political data like voter registration patterns or election results. If you're the redistricting commission, you might want to stay above the fray. You can also expect these so-called traditional redistricting criteria to conflict with one another. And legal standards like one person, one vote avoid some but not all distortions of democracy. The Voting Rights Act adds complicated constraints. And so in a broad summary, the question is, can statistics play a role in the process of helping government function better by formalizing what it means for a redistricting plan to be better or worse to the public interest? So the idea of combining density, variation, and compactness grew out of this. I mentioned this public television discussion that housing density was a key marker explaining the difference between red states and blue states, or red areas and blue areas within states. And the idea is that if you use population density, which is just census count divided by the geographic area of the district, that you could use that as a proxy for partisan preference, that high density might be areas that lean Democratic, low density might be areas that lean Republican, and that you could develop a criterion that favors less variation in population density as a way of indirectly inducing some competitiveness into the system. Now, I mentioned here that we use geometric compactness as a, quote, tuning parameter to reflect respect for political subdivisions. And the logic of that went as follows, that if you had, I use New York as an example. In New York, if you wanted to have elections that were as competitive as possible by having similar population density across districts, what you could do is have one district that started on 10th Avenue, Manhattan, and went all the way up to Lake Erie, and another district that was on 9th Avenue, Manhattan, and went all the way up to Lake Erie. And you could have these spaghetti string districts that would mix high density and low density areas, and you could have competitive elections, but you would sacrifice something else that you care about in the redistricting process, which is something about local area representation. So this idea of incorporating compactness as a, quote, as what I call here a tuning parameter, giving some weight to it in the measure of performance, is an attempt to make it so that the shapes of the districts don't get too irregular. So now coming back to this formula, I'm going to point here, so we're saying a plan P, we might have different plans for the same state. There's a reference year, which we use the year 2000 as a reference plan. There's a measure V of variation in density across districts. We just use the average absolute deviation. So you think that each district has this is just a spreadsheet calculation. You calculate the density of each district, you calculate the average, and then each district has a difference from the average, and you just add up those differences from the average. That's the average absolute deviation. And then there's an average here called C bar, the average compactness across districts. This again is just a spreadsheet calculation. You calculate the REOC compactness, which is that area of the district divided by the area of a circle encompassing the district. And you take the average of those and you get a measure C bar, which is in this part. And our DVC score has weights 15 and 5. I'll talk about those in a moment. Where if the variation was exactly the same as in the reference plan, then this ratio would be 1, and so you'd have no, the DVC contribution there would be 0. And if you had exactly the same average compactness as the reference plan, this ratio would be 1. And so a DVC for the reference year is 0. If you had a plan with less variation than the reference year, then this ratio is going to be greater than 1, and so you get a positive number. If you have greater than compactness than the reference year, then this ratio is greater than 1. And so you see that positive values would be associated with greater compactness, but mainly with, you give more weight to the variance, to the variation in the density. And so positive values correspond to less variation in population density and greater compactness than the reference year. And so the first points here, directional considerations, so you associate higher scores with less variation in population density and greater compactness. A 0 is the same as the reference year, but negative scores are possible. If you were somehow worse than the year 2000 redistricting, the plan governing the year 2000, then you could have a negative score. And the coefficients 15 and 5 were chosen so that, just to scale the measure so that a score of 4, it's not a theoretical maximum, but 15 and 5 gave values where 4 would be a high score, so we thought it might be interpretable like a GPA. And the way we developed it, we used California data to partition 53 congressional districts into 212 quarter districts, and then we recombined them by a process we just named retiling. And in some of the different variations, we had the highest observed score we had was 3.0. And then once we developed this measure, we tested it on Texas data. We thought that would give a good test for our plan developed in one state and tested in another state. So this is some information on California. So this was for the year 2000. You see it had a DVC score of 0. The actual 2002 redistricting plan, this one that had so little turnover in the representation, either in the state legislature or the congressional seats, had a DVC score of negative 2.92. But when we did it 5 different ways, these are hypothetical plans that Heidi Fisher, who was the student who worked with me on it, supported by that innovation and research grant from the School of Public Health, just did 5 different variations on the idea. Here was the plan with a score of +3. These were just sort of different strategies of starting in Los Angeles, central Los Angeles, and having kind of a flower-shaped, petal-shaped plan in Los Angeles. You can see that you can do much better on this DVC measure than what we actually got. And here were some information that when you actually did take a look at voter registration data and the percentage of districts with a less than 10% voter registration advantage, it turns out that the 2000 plan and all of these hypothetical plans had, upwards of 1/3 of the districts, but fewer than half of the districts that were in this competitive range. But this 2002 plan, if you scrutinized it, you would see that there were far fewer districts where there was anything close to a competitive registration profile. Here is what it looked like in Texas. Again, in the year 2000, you get by design, by definition, you get a DVC score of 0 in the year 2000. The 2002 plan that was devised by the federal judges had a DVC score that was slightly negative. The plans that got put forward later actually had DVC scores that were quite negative. It was harder in Texas to come up with a DVC score that was positive, but it was just to say that it was possible to do so. And when you looked at the percentage of districts with less than a 10% margin of victory in elections, you would see that in 2000, the previous plan, there were more close districts. Excuse me. In 2002, there were fewer. In the 2004 and 6 plans, you see it bouncing around. It's the way the districts were drawn in Texas lent itself, I guess, to more polarization in the political system, you might say. But you do see that with this plan that had a positive DVC score, these are different statewide elections, and that you tended to do better in the plans that had higher DVC scores than in the plans that had lower DVC scores. Here's some other measures of performance. If you looked at the correlation between the DVC score and the percentage of California districts with less than a 10% advantage, you see a positive correlation. That's suggesting some face validity for the DVC measure. Similarly, although the correlations aren't as high, you see positive correlations between DVC scores and the percentage of Texas districts that had close elections. And in this sense, it might be like when you're making college admissions decisions, you know that SAT scores or GRE scores for graduate students, they aren't going to be perfectly correlated with performance in graduate school, but if they're positively correlated at all, there's a certain validity to using a measure like that. This is interesting in that the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, they didn't make use of, I went to some public hearings and tried to convince them to use this DVC measure. They didn't incorporate it to my knowledge, but they did a sort of more of a blindfolded approach to redistricting that didn't take into account partisan considerations, and they ended up with DVC scores for congressional, state assembly, and state senate districts that were much better than for the 2002 redistricting plan. Some discussion. The Texas redistricting controversy, I mean, you look at those DVC scores and you say, oh, the 2004 and 6 plans were really unfair in some sense. If you look at the political scientists often look at the percentage of the vote that one party gets across the state and the percentage of seats that they get. This is called the seats votes curve. If you're doing a good job of gaming the system, you get a higher percentage of seats than you get of votes. And it turns out that if you look at Texas during that decade, the Republicans were getting, 56% of the statewide election votes in the 2008 elections and upwards of 60% in the 2004 and 6 elections. And the percentage of seats that they got were, comparable to that, although maybe a little higher in the 2008 elections. Anyway, you can see how that process played out in Texas. There's some political science software that we used to estimate parameters of the seats votes curve that includes something called partisan bias, which is bad, responsiveness, which is generally good. And what we found was that DVC scores, higher DVC scores were associated with less magnitude of partisan bias, and there wasn't a clear pattern with responsiveness. And so we interpreted that as that the DVC score again has face validity. It's correlated with quantity that you might care about, and it doesn't reproduce a negative correlation between partisan bias and responsiveness, which is good. I'm going to breeze through this and try to leave some time for questions, but I comment that you could, if you were intentionally trying to make the DVC score to be higher, if you paid attention to it, you probably could have done even better than the Redistricting Commission did. I want to make the point that the DVC score is not the only possible performance measure, and maybe it shouldn't be viewed as the only performance measure, but the point I'd like to make is that it's a relevant performance measure, and that if it were published and people knew about it, people wouldn't sit idly by if they knew that their representatives who were drawing the lines were giving them values that were, negative 2.92. It just becomes a one-number summary that would translate what was being done in the back rooms into something that would be embarrassing to the people who did it. So how it might be used in the redistricting process, I make the point that this one-number summary facilitates communication. You could imagine decision makers calculating a DVC score for every proposed redistricting plan, and that if you publish it, it might not be the case that everyone embraces this logic. Maybe not everybody cares very much about competitive elections. And I'm not claiming any particular optimality property other than that citizens and stakeholders who might value such information might really, it might have the benefit of creating at least a few more districts that are competitive, and that might have a downstream effect on governance. I say here some properties of the DVC measure that it was associated with. There were favorable associations with value. I say it was developed based on data in California and then tested in Texas. We used average absolute deviation. We could have used standard deviation. But we just thought something that was easy for lay audiences to understand would be worthwhile. And I say that some of these details, like the weighting of factors of 15 and 5, which were in a 3-to-1 ratio, should be viewed as open to research, and this is really in some ways opens up a field. I draw an analogy to airline on-time arrival statistics, that if you just publish information, the airlines used to effectively lie about how fast their flights were to try to get an advantage in travel agent reservation systems, and that when you required them to report their proportion of flights that were, quote, on time, they then stopped pretending that their flights would get there faster, which would give them an advantage in the reservation systems, and they started reporting results that consumers might care about. It's even now when you sit on the runway for 45 minutes and they tell you it's still going to be an on-time arrival, you sometimes wonder why. It's because they want their statistics to look good. Anyway, I'm going to give a few acknowledgements. Again, this Research Innovation Award, without which we couldn't have done the empirical work. Some colleagues who gave helpful comments, including the reviewers and editors of Statistics, Politics, and Policy. And I think I'll stop there and open it up for questions.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Belin. That was really, really interesting, and I want to open this up to the Q&A now for folks. If you have a question, please type it in the field at the bottom of the chat window in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Dr. Belin, I would like to start things off. Actually, you kind of touched on this for a moment, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about your experience trying to communicate with the California Citizens Redistricting Commission about the idea of publishing a DVC score alongside each redistricting plan that they put forth for public consideration.
Well, thanks for that question. It actually brings back fond memories of public meetings. So it was very interesting. So I think in the first meeting I attended, I got there relatively early, and I was speaker number 83 or something like that, which each person had 2 minutes. So it was in, I don't know, the third hour or something like that before I finally got to have my 2 minutes with the commission. And I had actually prepared a little short PowerPoint to hand out to them so that because I thought I could prepare more information. So I gave a 2-minute version of this, and I found that the one question I got, I wasn't really convinced that they caught on to what I was talking about. The second meeting I went to, I was again about person number 80, but with I can't remember, a yellow colored chit, and that was after they had to go through 100 white chits or something like that. So I didn't get to speak to the commissioners until like midnight or something like that, and they clearly recognized me from the earlier time I had presented, and they nodded at a few of the points I was making, and I think they still didn't use DVC scores, but like I said, then later I presented this at the joint statistical meetings, and one of the discussants was a member of the Redistricting Commission, and I think he was happy that they did well according to our measure. One of the other comments I'll make, though, is how complicated these decisions are. I was interested in some of the other speakers where there's a representative from the Korean community who was bemoaning the fact that in the previous redistricting, the Koreatown in Los Angeles was split among 5 state legislative districts. And a concern about that is that if you're in Koreatown, you might not know who your representative is to go to. But on the other hand, there's a perspective that says that, well, maybe the Korean community can influence 5 different elections in a substantial way. So there are trade-offs, and it becomes the sort of the decision calculus is very confusing and tricky. And I think it's consistent with what you can see when communities can have their political voices diluted by being concentrated in a smaller number of districts. So it's complicated to think about, but the idea is that this DVC score might include some balance in some of those trade-offs.
Well, I do have another question for you. It is, do you believe that decision makers should always favor the plan with the highest DVC score?
Well, that's an interesting question too. I'll tell an anecdote about when I gave this talk in my own department in the colloquium series of the UCLA Department of Biostatistics, and my younger sister, who's kind of who writes a political blog and has political interests, was visiting that day, and she asked me a related question, which was, don't you think that a state might prefer having more safe seats than competitive seats, because the way the system is in Congress, where committee leaderships are based on seniority, it might be better to have the elections competitive in other states, but in your own state to have these safe seats. And I thanked my younger sister for giving me a hard question in my own colloquium, but I thought it was actually a really interesting point that encodes another political value that people might reasonably have, regardless of partisan interest. You might want to have representatives from your state have power in Congress, and get that by having seniority, and get that by not being challenged regularly in their home districts. So that's possible. And I think that another comment is that this DVC score is so crude. It's just based on census data and geography. It can't possibly be the best measure of political performance that is conceivable, but it might be the best choice when you're so constrained that you don't want to use anything other than census data and geography, or something like it might be a very good choice for commissioners to look at to get a sense of how a plan might play out in terms of how polarized the governance might be. So my comment is that you shouldn't be a slave to the DVC score, but neither should you suppress it. From a freedom of information vantage point, it should be published, it should be out there, and concerned citizens and public health advocates, I think, should get behind that idea, and if not the commission, get the press, get the Fourth Estate, get the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle and the Sacramento Bee to publish these numbers, and then it'll catch on.
It does sound like this is a kind of a top-level statistic that people can use to identify whether there might be an issue or not. Is that fair to say?
I think that is, and one of the challenges, but one of the beauties of statistics is if you can, I don't know, I got a colleague at the meetings this summer talked about statistics as being a system of trying to know where you can cut corners and summarize things based on global information without having to get down into all the details. So if you can get a one-number summary that conveys the information that you care about, that it's not, I don't know, when you go to the appliance store and you look at a refrigerator, there's a number there that's called the SEER number that there's some formality to it, that it has an actual meaning in terms of energy information usage. I don't know anything about that. That's like, I don't know how my car engine works, even though I know how to drive a car. But I know that higher SEER numbers are better, and so I can make an informed choice about, somewhat informed choice about which refrigerator to buy based on having a higher SEER number. That's the kind of level of information that consumers might reasonably care about, or your Consumer Reports tries to come up with a one-number summary for consumer products where higher numbers are better. That's kind of what we're after, and if you can, then we might be able to come up with a better version than this one that had the multipliers of 15 and 5 and the ratios as we did it. There would be different ways of doing it. The point is that by doing it some way or other, you're getting information that many people really care about.
Well, I think, thank you very much for that, Dr. Belin. I think we're running out of time, so we're going to wrap this up. Again, we really appreciate you joining us for this Continuing the Conversation webinar, both you, Dr. Belin, and everyone in the audience. Please join us on Wednesday, November 12th, when we continue the conversation with Sandra DeCastro-Buffington, who will discuss the impact that our jobs have on our health in her talk titled Unleashing the Power of Storytelling in Television, Film, and New Media to Improve Public Health and Well-Being. And again, if you missed any of our previous webinars, go to the Fielding School of Public Health's website, ph.ucla.edu. They are all archived there, and please allow a few days for this webinar to post as well. Again, thank you very much for joining us.